The first officer, who was now essentially captain, shouted, "Red alert! Red alert, all stations! Let's figure out where the heck this sound is coming from. Daruk," that's the security officer, dwarf, "I want you to go to the outside of the ship, put on a void suit, obviously, so you don't die out there, but figure out what's going on out there." So Daruk donned a void suit and bravely traveled outside along with Adashka, the evil drow, who basically found nothing. It was just a big old rock out there. This was when they learned the interesting rules about gravity in the Spelljammer setting, which is that the ship seems to have a sort of gravity plane, but when you're on the outside of the vessel, you can walk along it as if it was just a tiny planet, like the Little Prince or King Kai's world. I'm trying to think of other parallels. That's pretty much all that comes to my head right now. They also found out that by opening the ship's airlock, they essentially released some oxygen, which began to form a tiny bubble around the outside of the ship, allowing them to, essentially, if they wanted to take their masks off, breathe, though the air would eventually become stale after some time. They would need to maybe put some lichen up there or something else. Survival, in terms of breathing, suddenly had more options, and they had more places to build if they, of course, had spells or druidic abilities beyond level 3, and this is when the druid began to experiment and attempted to cast reverse gravity. Now, I don't know what compelled the druid to try to cast reverse gravity, as reverse gravity is not a spell a level 3 druid should be able to cast, but I'm guessing he misread his spell cards or something. But surprisingly, the spell worked. Now, this is when I'm going to reveal a little bit of backstory here. The characters were actually not level 3, as they'd all been led to believe, because they actually had elaborate backstories, which they were going to explore in flashback sequences to their pasts. And we did go through many of these, and every time they learned a little bit more about who they were or what happened in their pasts, essentially this unlocked levels for them, and this was their way of earning experience while essentially being trapped on board this ship floating in a void. As mentioned in last week's episode, there was a scratching sound on the outside of the ship, and they also noticed some sort of weird banging sound, as if something was banging around almost inside the ship, as well as from the vent system, there were loud guttural screeching noises. Something rather large and very much alive was on the ship with them, but it was inside the ship, wherever it was. Back to the druid's reverse gravity spell. Now, normally this would have not done anything, but because I felt like punishing my players even more for trying to cast a spell that was far outside of their level, I decided to go ahead and let gravity reverse. This propelled both Daruk and Adashka very far away from the ship, though they sort of remained in orbit around the outside of it in a very, very large arc. While the two of them were floating up in the air around the outside of the void ship, Daruk could have sworn he saw a single speck off in the distance, but it could have just been his imagination or something on the surface of his helmet. Meanwhile, inside the ship, the banging sounds became even more loud and furious, while the hydroponics bay seemed to flip upside down as all of the plants and dirt and soil flew out of the containers that they were supposed to be sitting in. This not only caused them to lose over 20% of their crops, which I repeat was not actually a food supply, but was useful as matter which could be converted into food, and it was also their only supply of oxygen. It also forced all of the player characters inside the ship to spend a little bit of time getting to know the ceiling very well. After the effects of reverse gravity's duration finally came to an end, Adashka and Daruk then took falling damage. Fortunately, Daruk knew Featherfall. The crew decided to check up on the status of their captain, who they'd locked in a broom closet, essentially, and maybe interrogate him and get some more information out of him as to where the sound could be coming from. When they unlocked the door, however, they found the room to be completely empty, no insane captain in sight, which was problematic, but could possibly be the source of the sound, they theorized. Looking for answers, they decided to finally go into Captain Angvar's quarters, wherein they discovered the bloodied body of a dead halfling stuffed into a secret compartment along with a hammer. The ship being of dwarven design meant that it had many hidden compartments, secret passageways, and other things containing dwarven artifacts, weapons, and complex locking mechanisms. For the security officer, however, this dead body was especially alarming, as it belonged to his former partner in crime, a halfling rogue by the name of Taimani.
Wherever you go in this life, Daruk, I'm gonna follow you. I'll be like your little shadow.
The players then had a flashback sequence to the town of Waterdeep, where they all participated in the first part of the Waterdeep Dragon Heist module. It started to become apparent that the way in which they'd actually afforded purchasing a Spelljammer ship in the first place was simply because they'd completed the Dragon Heist, and as they returned to what was essentially real time, they began to examine things on the ship more closely, hoping to find more clues that would hint at their own backstories. When a player examined the captain's desk, they discovered a prism-shaped opening. Recalling that the hilt of the hammer discovered earlier was prism-shaped, they decided to put two and two together and insert the hammer's hilt into the lock. Upon doing so, they noticed that the effigy of the Raven Queen was no longer on the desk, meaning former Captain Angvar must have been by to steal it. Fortunately, his sidearm was still in the possession of the first officer, but a few newly discovered hidden compartments containing no weapons or anything of any sort, combined with the weirdly smashed dead body, caused a lot of people to question whether or not it would be safe to sleep alone at night. Once a player recalled that they actually knew Dwarvish from a flashback, they were able to translate some of the writing on the handle of the Dwarven hammer, and that's when they discovered that it was in fact a key to unlock access to the ship's secondary engine, as well as its backup generator. Now, this was a ship of Dwarven design, and Dwarven spaceships tended to have one of two power sources. The most common source, of course, being magical spell slots expended in exchange for warp drive. Fortunately, none of the players had ever experienced Spelljammer before, and it was time for them to learn a little bit about it, specifically with regard to Dwarven spaceships. The head engineer, a surprisingly young, rebellious elf by the name of Vinx, sporting a blue mohawk, discovered a door in the engineering bay had suddenly become unlocked. Attempts to previously unlock the door had been unsuccessful due to it being not only of complex dwarven design, but also built out of Mistonium, which, as discussed earlier, is highly magic resistant. It was behind that locked door that the ship's backup propulsion system was finally revealed, as well as the source of the clawing and other noises coming from the vents. The backup system slept regularly on a massive bed of sawdust. A massive glass cylinder connected to the water recycler acted as its drinking supply, while the hydroponic recycler conveniently next door acted as its food supply. A massive wheel connected to an electric dynamo acted as its method of supplying energy to the ship's engines. And in case none of this fully described exactly what the creature was, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that it was a 7-foot-tall hamster, also known as a giant space hamster. One of the players found a convenient dwarven collar on the wall, which seemed to be permanently imbued with a sort of speak with animals spell. Upon placing the collar around his neck, the hamster took a gentle bow and then introduced himself as Mr. Wiggles.
"Oh, please. Mr. Wiggles is my father. You can call me Eobard Winthrop Wiggles III, Esquire."
A dwarven diagram next to the wheel when translated simply read, "Big wheel keeps on turning, engines keep on burning." At this point, the players were all having to start rolling for exhaustion, because they didn't actually know how long they'd been awake for before their minds had been wiped, and it turned out it was actually several hours. The players began debating where they should try to rest, as well as keep an eye on each other. The first officer, though, had no interest whatsoever in falling asleep in his normal room in his normal bed, expecting the captain to somehow be there invisibly to strike him and kill him in his sleep. So he decided to do what I guess any rational person would decide to do, and decided to sleep on the bridge. Just falling asleep on a cold metal floor. Sure. I then had the players roll dice to determine what types of dreams they would have and or what type of comfort level they would have during their sleep. Surprisingly, the guy sleeping on the cold metal floor on the bridge, Zool, the monk, who was the first officer, got a nat 20. That night, each of the players had semi-prophetic and or just weird dreams. Some of them were just kind of fun and cool. Some didn't even have dreams at all. But Zool dreamt about a beach, and it was a very vivid dream about a beach. And he saw waves crashing on a shore that seemed to be made out of a newspaper-like material, and the shore itself was also made of weird printed material. It didn't really seem to make sense visibly why everything was in this black and white sort of newspaper look, and he even examined like grains of sand on the beach, and he knew that if he could see them down to their microscopic level, even then they'd be covered in newsprint. It was just a very, very strange, vivid dream where scale didn't really seem to matter. And when he awoke on the bridge the next day, he felt sun on his face, which was unusual because the void itself didn't produce any sort of light. The void didn't cast shadows. It didn't really have any emissive property to it, and yet here he felt sunlight. And he looked out, but he did not see a sun. He just saw more void. But the wave crashing noises he'd been hearing while sleeping were still present while he was awake. And the beach that he'd been dreaming about was there. The island he'd been dreaming about was there. The ship was now floating in a sea of newspapery water, and before them lay an island with a visible dungeon entrance which could be seen from the naked eye. Clearly, there was more to the void than mere nothingness. And now, the seemingly lost players had a destination.